Okay, in the second chapter of Pirkei Avos, these are the words of Rav Gamliel. He says, "Edap bor yorechet." Now, we know there's a principle that derech eretz kodma leTorah, that for one to be the receptacle, or to have the wherewithal to be able to process Torah properly, it has to be predicated on certain innate characteristics that a person must possess. It's called derech eretz. There are certain attributes that a person possesses. For instance, the Rambam rules in the laws of Talmud Torah that if a person is a heretic, one is not permitted to teach that person Torah. Because the whole foundation of Torah is what is God's will. But if one doesn't believe in God, to teach and to lecture and to delve into the Torah, it's purely abstract intellectualism. It has nothing to do with spirituality. The only way one has the entry point into the spirituality of Torah, it must be founded and predicated on certain basic principles or foundations. Of course, one has to believe in God. You believe in God, then that person has relevance to be taught God's will. What is the prescription of life? But a person denies or doesn't believe in the basic foundation that this is God's world and God gave a script, a prescription of life, then the Torah itself has no value whatsoever. So that's understood, that one's learning or Torah relevance has to be predicated on that foundation. Identically, there are certain derech eretz's quality characteristics that a person possesses. If he is corrupt in basic morals and ethics as a human being, he has no relevance to Torah. You have to be a proper receptacle or domicile for Torah to have relevance to that location, which is the person himself. So what about a person's a bor? What's a bor? And it's the same word in English. A person's a bor means a person's uncouth. Not only does he not have Torah, not only does he not have knowledge or perform mitzvos, he's a person who doesn't even have the basic amenities of human behavior to relate to other people and have an understanding what responsibility is versus society versus his fellow human being. That's what a bor is. An uncouth, coarse human being who lives literally, he has an intellect, but he lives like a predator animal for himself without any concern for anybody other than himself. Ein bor yorechet. A bor has no relevance even to even have a sense of God, that fear of sin. It's survival of the fittest. Literally, he's a predator. He lives for himself and nothing other than that. So a person who's a bor, he doesn't even have the amenities of a human being, a refinedness, the basic ethics and morals of a human being. He has no chance even to fear sin because he doesn't see anything to be not permitted. Lo amar it's chosid. A person's unlearned. He cannot be a chosid. Now, what's the difference between a tzaddik and a chosid? A tzaddik is a person who does everything correctly. He's righteous. He's a righteous person. A chosid is a person who's devoutly pious. What's the difference between a person who does everything right and a person who's devoutly pious? A person who's a tzaddik means he's just. Justice is called tzedek. A tzaddik is a person who does everything justly, correctly. But he does that, he does nothing more than that. A chosid, a person who's devoutly pious, because he's touched in a certain way, he's always yearning to advance and to even go beyond that point. That's what a chosid is. He, in the words of the Talmud, osa chesed im kono, he does kindness with his maker. He's always looking to do more. As much as he doesn't feel he's done sufficiently, and therefore he always ups the level of accomplishment, and the goalpost is always set further. And he sets his own goalpost to keep advancing further and further. That's the chosid. An amoritz cannot be a chosid. Only a tzaddik can be a chosid, but an amoritz cannot be a chosid. So Rabbeinu Yonah, in his commentary, asks a question: if a person to be a tzaddik means you have to do everything correctly, you have to have a certain knowledge base. If one doesn't have a knowledge base, how do you know what you're doing correctly? Ignorance will not allow you to do everything justly and correctly. So how does the Mishnah say, Rav Gamliel say, Ein amoritz chosid? The inference is to be this advanced, devoutly righteous person you can't be, but the person does everything correctly, which conforms with all the spiritual norms of the Torah, that he could do. But how does he do that? So Rabbeinu Yonah explains that a person is a tzaddik, he can be instructed in his life what to do, which is correct, which is incorrect. What's a positive commandment, what's a transgression, a negative commandment. He can be instructed, but he's not motivated inwardly to do more, to advance himself. That's a person, there's an expression, the person's on fire, he goes for it. Only the person who's learned, because Torah touches a person in a certain way where actually you're affected. We say that the Gemara tells us in one location, cites a verse from prophets, where the prophet says, Kol dvorei ka'esh num Hashem, the words of Torah are like fire. And therefore the Talmud says that a person who's a young Torah scholar, it's like he has fire in the belly. And because he has fire in the belly, therefore he has certain intolerance for certain things because of his connection to the fire. And Rashi explains, if it's not, he's impatient and intolerant. That's what it means. That because he has the fire, the Torah is considered to fire, which is an illuminator, which warms, therefore he has a broadness and a depth of understanding, and he's able to internalize to a greater degree, and he appreciates the wrong of what the other person is doing. A person who doesn't have the Torah or doesn't have sufficient knowledge, although he knows it's not permitted, but nevertheless, he's not able to internalize the value of doing the wrong thing. But the person who studies Torah, although it's something which is intellectual, it's something, I'll give you the example of a person's nerve endings are damaged and he touches something which is hot, he's not able to sense the heat. And ultimately, he could be really damaged or burnt because of that. Since just as we have physical senses, there's spiritual senses. A person can have a sense whether something's right or wrong. But you have to be oriented and mentored and immersed in the spirituality of Torah. If you have sufficient involvement in Torah, that the person is considered a Talmud Chacham, that you engage sufficiently, those spiritual nerve endings are activated and sensitive to many things, to what's right and wrong. Within the physical right and wrong, that's purely intellectualism. I understand it's wrong. It's wrong to take something that's not mine. It's wrong for me to harm another person, to hurt a person, to embarrass a person. That's wrong. But in terms of spirituality, the only way you're able to have a sense of the right and wrong within the spiritual realm, you have to be spiritually oriented and touched and developed, only then you have that sense. So want to soar and advance, and whatever you have, you feel you haven't advanced sufficiently, that person only has that sense if he's immersed in Torah. And if you're immersed in Torah, then the person can be more than the tzaddik, he'd be the chassid. He's actually motivated to keep advancing. So an amoritz cannot be a chassid, because a chassid means he goes beyond the call of duty. He always feels he's fallen short of his responsibility. He has a sense of beholdenness to God. But the tzaddik is a person who just does everything right. And to do everything right, you can have a checklist and in advance be advised and instructed what's right and what's wrong, and you do what's right and you don't do what's wrong. Therefore, the amoritz cannot be a chosid, but he could be the tzaddik, the ignorant person. Ignorant means he hasn't studied, could be the just person, but he cannot be the devoutly righteous person for that reason. when it says a bor, as we said, a bor is a person, not only is he unlearned, he hasn't been developed as what an upright human being is. That's what a bor is. It's not only, we're not talking about social skills. We're talking about basic concepts of humanity. Give you an example. The law is that to be qualified as a witness to testify in court, you have to meet certain criteria. If a person's a thief, he had stolen, he's disqualified. He's not qualified to be a witness. What about if a person is related, he's not qualified to be a witness. A person has a conflict of interest, he's not qualified to be a witness. A person's a usurer, which is also, it's violating Torah within a monetary context, because Torah, a Jew is not permitted to lend money with interest. And he does, he's disqualified. He's not qualified to be the witness. What about if a Jew is a gambler? A gambler, is he qualified to be a witness or not? When a person gambles, is he a thief or is he not a thief? So one opinion is, on a Torah level, he's definitely not a thief. But rabbinically, he's disqualified. Why is he disqualified rabbinically? Because a person, when he enters into a wager, there's a certain element. The reason why he's entering into the wager, because he believes that he will win. That's why he's entering into the wager. And when he actually has to pay, he's paying based only because he didn't understand to what degree he was going to lose. He was convinced he was going to win, or pretty much going to win. So since it borders on giving up something against your will, it touches upon stealing, therefore rabbinically they disqualify them. But let me explain it. If a person gambles and he puts the money on the table, and everybody puts the money on the table, and the winner takes all, and whoever put the money loses, that person is not disqualified, because that's no different than any other investment. I put my money in an investment, I believe I'm going to win. Once you've already parted with your money, then it's no different than anything else. You part, the other man takes the money because you gave it to him. But if a person didn't put the money on the table, and he believes he hasn't, through his action, indicated that he's convinced that he's parting with the money by putting it down, it has a semblance of stealing, therefore rabbinically he's disqualified. Okay, that's one opinion. And that's the prevalent opinion. But there's one opinion says that the only time a gambler is disqualified from being a witness is only if he's a professional gambler. And what's the reason? A man who does not participate in society, to contribute to society as other people do and see things, automatically his whole perception of life is always a gamble. A person who earns a livelihood as everybody else does, that person, he engages with people within the norms of society. So he has a rational perception of right and wrong. But a person, everything he's involved in regarding his livelihood, everything is a gamble, and his primary livelihood comes from gambling, and he does not engage within the norms of society, the person is disqualified. Why? Because when he witnesses something, he witnesses it within distorted reality, which is his own reality of what life is. But that's not what life is. His perception, everything is a gamble. So he processes things differently. Therefore, he's disqualified. A boor, not being mentored or exposed to the norms of society, ethics and morals wise, he has no sense of certain things which normally a person would be between right and wrong. I'll give you an example. The law is that to be qualified to be a judge, you need a level of ordination for Moshe Rabbeinu. So if that's the case, if you didn't live Moshe's time, how was a person qualified to be a judge? As long as the person initially was ordained by Moshe, that person is qualified to pass on that ordination, to make an evaluation, ordain the next generation, and one generation after another. But you realize to be qualified to be an ordained judge, which is a Torah judge on a Torah level, which you're able to render certain verdicts, even the death penalty, punishment, many things, an ordinary person, regardless of what his Torah knowledge is not qualified to render those judgments. You have to be ordained. So let's say a person would have a monetary issue with another person, a claim. To be able to locate that kind of caliber judge was very difficult. So if that's the case, society was actually being victimized because there wasn't enough of a judicial system to deal with all the caseload of people's claims against one another. So the rabbis went and they legislated that even an ordinary Jew is qualified to be a judge. And to be a judge, to adjudicate a monetary case, you have to have three men. So the Talmud asks why. So it says because a person who engages in business and understands the rudiments of ownership and transferring ownership and the rights and wrongs within the monetary system, that's sufficient. That he has an understanding of right and wrong, therefore he qualifies as a judge. So the Talmud asks, what about, you have three people, what about one doesn't or two don't? He says it's inevitable that within three you can have one who does, and he will explain it to the other two, although they're not adept in commerce or doing transactions, acquisitions, he will give them an understanding and the rationale of ownership in all these various areas. So you see, it's only because he engages in the norms of society, because he himself buys and sells and purchases it, and he's within the system, that's why he's qualified on a rabbinical level to render decisions within the monetary system. A boor, a person who's, as I said, he's uncouth, he was never exposed to the rudiments of society, not even on a behavioral level, morals and ethics. This person has no sense of wrong. Therefore, he cannot be a Yirei Chet. He cannot fear sin. What is sin? Why is it wrong? There's always the question, why is it wrong? And he justifies anything. You know, it's interesting, many years ago, and I never understood it, but today, unfortunately, I still don't understand it, that in Europe, there was a person many years ago who used to visit New York, and he was a man who was a very wealthy Jew. He was originally born in Israel. He was a close friend of Shimon Peres and that whole echelon of the Israeli government. He was born at the same time in the 20s. And he used to visit New York very often. And he would come to my shiurim at the Yad Avram. And he was a banker. He was an international oil person. And he had daughters, only daughters. And one time, one of them came to see me, and she said to me, in Europe, people who have wealth, they have to conceal their wealth. Why? Because people almost are ashamed to be known that they have wealth. Because society sees people who have wealth that they victimizes the not-haves. The not-haves don't have because the wealthy people took advantage and denied the people who don't have opportunities to have. Therefore, people don't want to be seen as so-called hoarders or victimizers. Therefore, they concealed their level of wealth for that reason. So I said, I never heard of such a thing. It's a laissez-faire society. It's open to everyone. Opportunities available to everyone. And everybody could succeed. And whoever succeeds, more power to him. The one who fails, he failed for whatever reason, or didn't succeed, whatever reason. And that was the way we saw things in the United States, that opportunity is there for every human being to partake, no discrimination. Everybody is equally right, has a right to whatever the opportunities which exist. Today, it's not so simple any longer. Why did the wealthy have? They have this, they have that. They're eligible for certain tax loopholes because of what, when, where. But if you understand the system, that we want to encourage people to actually, who have the capability to build the economy and advance themselves, so we offer certain opportunities to them. And when you reach that level, you also, that's not called victimizing the lesser, and the ones who have more, they have so-called, they take advantage of society. And factually, just based on facts, in terms of taxes and everything else, the big corporations, they underwrite a major part of the economy because they pay taxes, or the people education is underwritten. We have more commercial properties. Those commercial properties, they underwrite a greater percentage of that budget for education. But that's So therefore, within the concept of understanding how society works in terms of monetary engagement, that person has a sense of right and wrong. But if a person himself never invested in that area and he has a whole different perception, and many of these people never really went through the educational system and whatever it is, a good part of them, they have no sense of what's the right of ownership. What gives you a right to own something? As a result of that, they say, what do you have that right? What do you have more than I do? You denied me. You should share what you have with me. What do you mean I should share it? You never earned it. I did earn it. And I earned it legally. Well, society is not fair. You control, you dictate the laws and you legislate the laws and whatever it is, and therefore everything's in your advantage. But again, it's similar to the concept in Bur Yorichet. Unless a person has the amenities through the mentoring and development exposure of ethics and morals, he has no sense of what sin is even. And he justifies everything because he doesn't understand why it's wrong. I'll give you an example. The Talmud speaks about cannibals, that there was a great rabbi. He was one of the greatest interpreters of the Mishnah. His name was Reish Lakish. Reb Shimon ben Lakish, he was the brother-in-law of Rabbi Yochanan. He was Rabbi Yochanan's greatest Talmud. At one time, he was a bandit before he became a Baal Tshuva. The story is, the Gemara tells a story, Reb Shimon ben Lakish, he was known as Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan was bathing in the Jordan. And it was known, Rabbi Yochanan, who was the leading Torah sage in Israel, and he's the author of the Jerusalem Talmud, he had a beauty of one of a kind of a beauty. He radiated holiness besides his physical beauty. And Reb Shimon ben Lakish was so powerful, he was able to by jumping, to span the Jordan River. And as he jumps across the river, he sees Rabbi Yochanan bathing in the Jordan. And he sees he's radiating with beauty. He says, your beauty really belongs to a woman, not to a man. This is the first time I've ever seen such beauty. It went beyond handsome. So he says to Reish Lakish, Reb Shimon Lakish, I have a sister who's more beautiful than I am. If you're willing to give up this background of yours and get involved to be an observant Jew and to study, I will give you the hand of my sister in marriage. And he agreed. And he became Rabbi Yochanan's leading student. And nobody was really his match. So Reish Lakish himself was very adept, like in the martial arts, in weaponry, all these things. And was captured by a bunch of cannibals. But these cannibals, they weren't so bright. And they said, before we go and we kill you, we eat you, we give you one last wish. Whatever it is, we'll give you that last wish. So he says, not a problem. And as I said, he was a very smart man. And he says, my wish is that I want to tie every one of you up. So they agree. He ties them hand and foot. And when he ties each one hand and foot, he kills every one of them. And this is something he could do because in the past, that's what he was involved in. And he killed them. So rather than him being the one to be eaten, he killed those who threatened him, his life, and they would have killed him. Now the question is, any rational human being, how does one kill a human being? Human life is infinitely precious. To kill a human being, as you kill an unintelligible animal for its flesh, you kill a human being who is a whole different dimension of person. How do you kill a human being? Now the question is, a person who has no understanding that a human being is more than an intellectual animal, but there's a spiritual component in him. And it's much more than that. And it's not a monetary value. Well, he's creative and productive and the animal's not. So what about you have an ox and you live in an agricultural society and you kill the ox who pulls the plow, which is the source of all life. You kill him. So if you kill the ox, why can't you kill the human being? So you have to have some degree of understanding that why the human being towers upon anything in the physical existence. If not, you could justify and rationalize anything because you don't understand the difference between an animal and a human being. And therefore, and these people who are literally from the caveman age, from the archaic people, they were never exposed to ethics and morals and understanding of the value of a human being. That person is in yorichet. He cannot have a sense of right and wrong. So even when he does wrong at the most extreme level, he doesn't understand why he's doing the wrong thing. As a result of that, he has no relevance to fear of sin. However, a person who is raised within the norms of society, although he may be ignorant of responsibilities, but the basic amenities of life, senses of human life, and how to treat another human being, that much he has. But even if that person now was instructed to do everything justly, even as a Jew, he could be a tzaddik. To be a chassid, that's something else. That you have to have belly in the fire in the belly. Fire in the belly, that you have to have the Torah itself. Because the Torah touches you and ignites you, and once you're ignited, you go the extra mile. It's very interesting. The Gemara tells us that what was the repository for the Torah in the Mishkan? The repository for the Torah in the Mishkan was the Ark. It was called the Aron. The Aron, what was contained within the Aron? There were two sets of tablets that Moshe had brought to the Jewish people. The first set of tablets, after 40 days, Moshe comes, he sees the Jews involved in idolatry, he smashes the tablets. He goes, supplicates God for forgiveness. On Yom Kippur, the 10th day of Tishrei, comes out with the second set of tablets. We're fully reinstated, we're forgiven. That's the second set of tablets. 10 commandments are on these tablets. The first tablets were broken, the second tablets are intact. They are put into the Ark. In addition, before Moshe passed away, the Torah was written in its entirety, what we have today. That was also in the Ark. That was in the Ark or outside the Ark. So what is the repository of Torah? Of the Torah, the broken tablets and the whole tablets, and the Torah, that's the Ark. Now, there's a question which the Talmud asks, if the tablets are broken, why put it in the Ark? So the Talmud says that let's say you have a great Torah sage, and who gets older, he forgets his learning. Do you have to accord him the same honor as the person he was when he had all the Torah knowledge? So the Talmud says, we learned from the broken tablets that just as those tablets retained their holiness, because initially they had etched on that stone, the 10 commandments, this Torah sage who had forgotten his Torah study because of his age, it's not something due to his own level of irresponsibility. He retains that same status of holiness, and you have to quote him that same level of honor. That's referred to Talmud Chacham Shishtachach Talmudo. Machmas Otzo, Talmud Chacham had forgotten his Torah's knowledge. It was something beyond his ability, and you have to quote him the exact same honor as if he would have the full knowledge. Now, but what is a Torah sage? Is a Torah sage a walking encyclopedia of Torah knowledge, or it's much more than that? Now, when the Torah describes the Aron, the repository, the receptacle which contained the Torah says you should make it out of gold from the outside and the inside. It was comprised of 3 boxes. There was a very large gold box, according to the dimension which is prescribed in the Torah. There was an inlay of a box made of wood, of acacia wood. And then you had another box made of gold. That was the most inner box. So you had 3 boxes, one in the other, one in the other. The inner and the outer box were gold. The Torah makes it a point. It should be gold from the outside and the inside. So the Talmud says, what's the takeaway from this? Talmud Chacham shein tocha gebari in Talmud Chacham. A Torah sage, that unless his innards are identical to what he looks like on the outside, he's not a Torah sage. Meaning he has to be genuine. That whatever knowledge he has, it has to be internalized, that he is that. It's not do as I say, but do as I do. Because he's a person who's fully imbued and internalized with his Torah knowledge. That's a Talmud Chacham. So we speak about Ein Omer Chosid, when we speak about the person who's the Torah sage, who becomes the Chosid, that he has fire in his belly. Fire in his belly means literally the fire has to be in his belly. If it's his belly, then he's motivated, he takes off, and he soars every moment of his life in Torah. But if it's purely abstract, intellectual Torah knowledge, he's not touched the same way. He may do the right thing, but it's not internalized sufficiently. Therefore, that person cannot be the chassid, and he will not be the chassid. It's interesting. There's a question which is asked. We find that when God offered us the Torah at Sinai, we accepted unequivocally. We said, Nazav v'nishma. And soon afterwards, the Torah tells us that God put a mountain over our heads and gave us an ultimatum. Either accept the Torah or be buried under the mountain. So the Midrash asks a question. If when he initially offered it to us, we said we accept unequivocally, why is he putting the mountain over our heads and giving us this ultimatum? We already embraced it. And not only that, when we said Nasa v'nishma, we accept unequivocally, God says, who revealed this secret to my children that they speak like angels, that they don't even have to know the extent of the obligation, and they accept and embrace it immediately. They're just waiting for the charge. So after we accept at this unbelievable level that even God is amazed, all of a sudden he's putting a mountain over our heads and giving us an ultimatum. Either accept or be buried. It's like a person says, are you going to do it? He says, of course I'm going to do it. I will do it even before you ask. If you don't do it, I'm going to beat you to a pulp. Doesn't make sense. The man accepted to be fully dedicated to whatever the cause is. What he threatened him, that he can beat him to a pulp. So the Midrash answers, says something interesting. The two aspects of Torah. There's the observance of the mitzvos, do the positives and don't transgress the negatives. And you study, but to become what God expects of every one of us, an advanced Torah scholar, to fully understand the Torah and be able to internalize it, there you have to forego many physical amenities which interfere with the person becoming spiritualized. For instance, there's a mitzvah in the Torah, Kedoshim Tiyu. You should be holy. You should be holy because I am holy. So the way the Midrash explains, of course, what you're not permitted to do, you're not permitted to do. What about something which is permitted to you, but it's not a necessity? Should you win yourself from even in areas which are permitted? So the Midrash says, Kaddish is hatzmo mutaloch. You should actually sanctify yourself, areas which are permitted to you. I'll give you an example. If a person wants to take an extra portion of food, and he's had enough to sate him, not to sate him, but to nourish him and to be fully healthy. And just for the sake of, because he enjoys it, he wants to take another portion. There's no provision. But if a person passes on that extra portion, that he's a fulfillment of the positive commandment of you weaning yourself from physicality. Because the more we wean ourselves from physicality, we have a greater sensitivity and capacity for spirituality. Therefore, that's what it's about. So to be fully capable and qualified to come upon the secrets of Torah and be touched by Torah, to be spiritualized, the more we wean ourselves from physicality, the less of a barrier there is, and the more we're open for this internalization. Otherwise, we can't. A person who's a hedonist and he's fully immersed in physicality, and all that matters is the desire, although he does everything right. According to Ramban, he's an ogre. For instance, a man has a harem of wives, and he engages them, everything within the context of halacha, of Torah law. He eats, everything's kosher, but he eats a 20-course meal. And everything he has is beyond the normal, beyond the pale. The man is a hedonist. A man who lives a life of that, the emphasis is the material, the spirituality secondary. As a result of that, this person himself does not have the capacity to fully appreciate and sense what it is. Therefore, this man is not moving much. He's not going anywhere. But the more a person gives up the physical and the amenities and the pleasures of life for the spirituality, this allows him to have a greater capacity to be able to internalize the spirituality. When we said Nasav v'nishma at Sinai, That was only in regard to observe the Torah. But what about to forego many of amenities of life, the pleasures of life, where we'd have to compromise certain conveniences and certain availabilities that they weren't willing to do? Because to be able to fully comprehend and understand and have clarity within the oral Torah realm, you have to literally dedicate your life for that. Unless you're fully dedicated, which is synonymous with foregoing many things that they weren't willing to do. God says, you know something? But since the core and the lifeline and the heartbeat of Judaism is the feeling and to sense its value, if you don't sense its value, it's just a question of time before it peters out. Therefore, he put the mountain overhead to know you have to be dedicated, commit yourself that you're even willing to give up some of those pleasures of life, which are basic amenities. If you normally would like to sleep 15 hours a night, you can only sleep 8 hours a night or 6 hours a night. Or if you want to eat more, you have to eat less. You have to give more time to, well, I could study an hour. Why should I study 3 hours? Because that's why you're here. You're here to address and advance your spirituality and bring about a certain end result. And you're not here that. It's like a person comes many years ago. I once mentioned, I hired somebody to work for me, and he was very capable and qualified. And he works for me for 4 weeks. And I mentioned, he used the term, I never heard the term before. So when I hired him, I said, look, my hours, I don't work within hours. Whatever I have to do, I'm there to do it. So if you want to work for me, you have to be available to teach, to engage with people whenever they have to be engaged with. He works for me for 4 weeks. He says to me, Rabbi, you realize you're trespassing on my time. Didn't understand what that meant. He says to me, you know, when I originally took the position, I thought it would be a 9 to 5 position. And now I see if I'm at the beck and call of people's needs, my life is being trespassed. You're trespassing. I said, you know something? I told you initially when I offered you the position, when you were interested, that it's not limited to hours. Either you're dedicated to the cause or you're not dedicated to the cause. Okay? Kept quiet. And not only that, right now you're on trial. If you want to leave, you're welcome to leave. You're not committed to me, I'm not committed to you. Comes back 2 weeks later, he wants a raise. Yeah, the man's within the trial period, he wants a raise. I said, you know something? I don't think this position is for you. I think you should look elsewhere. You set your terms in advance and you'll have whatever you're supposed to have. The Jews they wanted to set their own time schedule. God says to be able to advance and understand and appreciate who you are, you have to engage in the process. See, so the Midrash points out something very interesting. We have 2 paragraphs in the Shema. We have 3, but the first 2. The first one is called Kabbalas Ol. You accept the yoke of God. In the first paragraph of the Shema, it says you should love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your possessions. Okay? In the second paragraph, it says you should love God b'chol levavchem, b'chol nafshechem, with all your heart, with all your souls. It doesn't say b'chol mo'odechem. It doesn't say with all your possessions. The first paragraph is in the singular. The second paragraph is in the plural. Meaning, only very few people, which you could count them on one hand, due to their love, they're willing to give they serve God with all their heart, even give their lives. What about b'chol mo'odechem? Give away, mo'odech doesn't only mean possessions. Your conveniences, your pleasures, are you willing to forego that? There are very few people. Those are individuals. That's why the first paragraph is in the singular. The second paragraph, which is in the plural, even among the masses, they will do with all their heart. They'll even die for Judaism. But on a daily basis, to forego amenities that they would want to have, that they're not willing to do. And therefore, that's the second portion of that's why he put the mountain over our heads. Because the vast majority weren't willing to do that. God says, no, initially, whether you do it or not, but you have to be committed that that's the goal. That's the objective. That's the ultimate level of achievement. Therefore, he put the mountain over the heads for the second paragraph, not for the few which are willing to give it all away at every level. There's a famous argument in the Gemara between Reb Shimi Yochai. Reb Shimi Yochai is the author of the Zohar, and Rabbi Shmuel. How does one live his life? Rabbi Shmuel says, how do you live your life? What's the prescription of life which conforms with the Torah? That, of course, you're supposed to study Torah, you're supposed to do mitzvahs, not transgress. But when it comes to earn a livelihood, you have to engage in the world as everybody else engages in the world. When you live in an agricultural society, he says you plow in the plowing season, you sow in the sowing season, you reap in the reaping season, you thresh and winnow and do everything else. That's what you do. And you're conforming to the will of God. Reb Shimi Yochai says if a person does all that, he says, Torah b'teileh, when's the person going to have time to study Torah? So Reb Shimi Yochai says, you should study Torah, God will provide your livelihood. So Rabbi Shmuel says, but the second paragraph of the Shema says, if you listen to my mitzvos and you follow with all your hearts and with all your lives, you're going to bring in your harvest. So evidently, we're talking about people who are observing or committed to the Torah with all their hearts and all their souls. And it says, I will give rains in their time. You bring in all the produce. So evidently, you see, that is the right way to do it. So Shimon Yochai says, no. The second paragraph of the Shema is speaking about Einam Osim Ritzon Shamakom. They're not really doing the will of God the way it should be done. So the obvious question is, the paragraph starts, if you will listen and heed the mitzvahs that I'm commanding today, and you serve me with all your hearts and all your lives, the rains will come in their times and you'll bring in your own harvest. He says, those people are not doing the ultimate will of God. Why? So with the Midrash, that's the understanding. Ultimately, what God would want, even to forego the amenities of life. And if you do that, he cites a verse, others will appreciate you, or they will do your bidding. They will bring in your harvest. But now that you're not willing to give up the amenities of life, you're serving God with all your heart, you're serving with all your souls, even to give your life. But since you're not willing to forego the amenities of life, therefore you're not going to be able to internalize the Torah fully. Therefore, you will not be able to be touched the way you should be touched. Therefore, you have to go and you have to bring in your own harvest. If you're willing to compromise in your Torah study for the sake of the material to that degree, and you're not willing to give up those amenities, then God will not provide. You have to provide you for yourself. You have to go out and do it. But if a person is willing, as the first paragraph says, it's not only give your life, it's modecha, even your possessions, your assets, the pleasures of life, even that you're willing to forego, then only then will I provide for you. That's what it means in Mosa Ritzon Shel Mokom. They're not doing the true will of God at the most advanced level, and therefore God will provide the rains. You're going to have the bounty, but you're going to go bring in the bounty yourself, which will be an infringement of where you really should be. There's a concept known as Torasum Noso, a person whose Torah is the equivalent of his vocation. And the Maral of Prague says that after the era of the early commentators, there's no such thing as a person his Torah is his vocation. What does that mean? When a person is committed to a vocation, he doesn't compromise on that time. He's fully engaged in work. Why? Because his livelihood is primary and a priority in his life. And if you have to succeed, you can't afford to give up even a minute. If you need that minute for your livelihood. A person who studies Torah, that he doesn't compromise it for anything unless it's within the realm of law, that he's supposed to compromise it, then you're not treating the Torah as you would treat your vocation. In the time of the Rishonim, of the early commentaries, they were committed to a level that nothing would interfere. Nothing within the physical realm would interfere with the Torah study. There's the famous story, Rameir of Marabi Rameir of Rutenberg. He was the leader of the Ashkenazi Jews in the year about 1150. And Ashkenazi Jews, they lived in vassal states in Germany, Bavaria, whatever the various locations were called, but that was Germany. And the kings, the German kings, they were always anti-Semitic, and they taxed the life out of the Jews. But what happens when you can't? You've taxed them, you're killing the goose that lays the golden egg. What happens? So you try, he's not dead yet, you try to squeeze a little bit more out of them. So what did he do? The Marami Wittenberg, who was the leading Torah sage of all Ashkenazi Jewry, he went and he took them captive, put them in a tower, and he said to the Jews that if you want me to release your rabbi, you have to come up with an enormous amount of wealth. And if not, he will die in the tower. That's what the German king said. So the rabbi immediately gave out the order that they should not raise not a gulden for him for his ransom, not anything. Why? Because he said if the king gets away with this new ploy of taking captive the leading Torah sages, they're just going to destroy the Jewish community, because that he's going to literally deplete them. They're not going to be able to survive. Therefore, he forbade them to raise the money. And he died in the tower. He was there for years until he finally died in the tower. And then afterwards, he wouldn't even release his remains, the king, because he wanted to give that for ransom. Now, when he was in the tower, it was a darkened tower, pitch black. I mean, they fed him food or whatever it is. He was able to live, but he died there. And the king would play games with him. And he would say to him, I'm coming back at a certain time. And if you don't know the exact amount of time that you're there, if a person's in a dark room, a dark cell, a chamber, and you have no light, eventually you lose track of time. And you have no idea how quickly or how slowly time passes. So he'd come to Wittenberg, and he says, if you don't tell me how long you've been there since the last time I spoke to you, we will torture you to death. And he told him exactly to the minute, as accurate as time could be. They had sundials, they didn't have a watch. He told him exactly. He said to the rabbi, how do you do this? You're in this darkened tower. How do you have such a sense of time? He says, you don't understand. Every moment of my life is invested responsibly, meticulously, and with great value. I know when I study a certain amount of the Talmud, it takes a certain amount of time. If I just review it, if I delve into it more deeply, it takes this amount of time. So therefore, every segment of my day, every minute, I understand its potential, its value. As a result of that, that's exactly how I engaged the period of time. Although I have no sundial, I have nothing, but based on my Torah knowledge, that's how I know exactly how much time has passed. That was the response of the Marami Wittenberg. So what's Torasum Noso? These people, every moment, literally just as a person would not, he's involved in the greatest deal of his life. He's not going to interrupt it for anything, because nothing has that level of value. The way they revered and esteemed and understood the value of what they were engaged in, nothing could have any relevance of importance to be able to compromise what they were doing. Therefore, every moment was fully invested. Those people at another level, that kind of person, the Maral of Prague says, ended at the end of the era of the early commentators. Although we have great Torah sages and everything else, but these people live at the level of angels. The Talmud tells us this interesting expression in the Talmud, Lo nidna Torah l'malchi ashoris. When the Torah is given to the Jewish people, Jews are not angels. They're not ministering angels. An angel literally is a spiritual being that the whole question of slacking or being in a position even to not fully fulfill what the charge is, it's not possible for an angel. We're only human beings. Even the greatest human being. King Solomon says, there's no perfect tzaddik. Even the tzaddik has his skeletons in his closet. Of course, he removes them by doing tshuva, but there's no perfect person because we're human beings. So even at the time of the earlier commentators, time of the Tanoim, the great rabbis of the Mishnah, King Solomon lived before all of them. And he says, there's no perfect tzaddik who doesn't sin. Every human being has some degree of what? Of lack of perfection. Of course, you have to address it, you have to correct it, do your best, whatever it is. But if you do your best, Although you're not perfect, you're bordering on the perfect because you're only a human being. So that, but an Amoritz could be a tzaddik, but he's not doing his best because he has a greater capacity. He has a capacity to be a chosid, but to be a chosid, that you have to study Torah. Because only through the spiritualization of the physicality of the human being do you have a sense to want to forego the material, the pleasures of life. How does a person have that understanding and value? You have a child's immature, he doesn't understand the value of opportunity. The parent who's lived through life a little bit more and understands how not only is it a privilege, an opportunity, it's a necessity. The child sees it, it's not that important. The parent sees it as a necessity. Why does the person see it as a necessity and the child doesn't? Because the child doesn't begin understanding. The parent has greater level of understanding. But all of us, we understand something is special. We don't understand it's a necessity. But if you don't appreciate and understand what something is in its reality, we see it as necessity. We're not there yet, it's a necessity. Once you see it as a necessity, if it's a necessity versus something which is an additional, you pass on the additional for the sake of the necessity. And that's what it is. Person understand that if he takes off time, he's not going to have his position to earn a livelihood, to support his family. That time is a necessity. Whatever else he wants to do, other interests, hobbies, whatever it is, that's an extra. If I have time, I'll address that. But if I don't have time, I have to first address my necessity. The more we advance, the more we're spiritualized through Torah study, we begin seeing the opportunity as necessity. And once it's necessity, then we appreciate it. Therefore, it's not that difficult to forego the pleasures, but you have to arrive at that point. And that's what the average person is not willing to do, willing to study. But to study where we're conflicted, I think I've studied enough, I've given up enough, rather than it saying that as much as I have, it's never enough, because it's a question, if I breathe 5 minutes a day, why is that enough? Because if you don't breathe continuously, ultimately, you're not going to live. And what about if I hold my breath every 3 seconds? You understand it's not living normally. You're still depriving yourself of a certain degree of oxygen. The Torah itself is Ke'eb Chayin V'Orach Yameinu. It's our life in the length of our days. It's basic to our function. So as every breath, every word we study, everything we imbibe of spirituality is integral to our growth. You say a person is potentially is grow to 5'10", and what happens if his height is only 5'4"? Because we're going to feed him less healthy food, and through malnourishment, he's not going to meet his full physical potential. 5'4", there are enough people 5'4", you can function fully, but I'm supposed to be 5'10", I'm not supposed to be 5'4". That's my potential. That's added, You're 6'4", you'll join the Globetrotters, and you shoot the hoop or whatever it is. You understand? We're not talking about you want to be a Globetrotter in the spiritual realm. You have to appreciate the opportunity, but when you appreciate opportunity, the opportunity becomes a necessity, and that's what it's all about. So Rabbi Gamliel says, "Ein bur yorichet," the uncouth person, he has no sense of ethics because he has no ethics and morals. He has no sense of right and wrong. The Amoritz, the unlearned person, he could be just, but he can't be devout. Devoutly righteous means he's motivated. As much as he does, he feels he has to do more. And this is all dependent upon environment, involvement, mentored, who are your role models, and all that's what it's all about. If a person, most people, when they reach a certain point of their so-called the head of the pack, they plateau. Other people, they're motivated, just keep going, regardless where everyone else is. They've left everybody in the dust, and they're way ahead, and they just keep going. They're self-motivated. Why are they self-motivated? And that's an indication of greatness. It's not, I want to be the best. I want to be who I'm supposed to be. The person who understands who he's supposed to be, he goes for it regardless of where everybody else is. The difference between Avram Avinu and Noach was tzaddik b'dorosov. Noach was a tzaddik relative to his generations. He was greater than all of them. He soared above all of them. But it was all relative to his generations. But if he would have lived in the era of Avram Avinu, he couldn't hold up a candle to Avram Avinu, because Avram Avinu was motivated, had nothing to do with generations. Avram Avinu, understanding what he understood, as much as he advanced, he felt he never advanced sufficiently, and therefore he kept advancing. Avram Avinu never plateaued. Most of us, once we feel we know enough, we've studied enough, we've done enough, we say we plateau. A person who understands and gets it, as we say, he really gets it, as much as he does, it's never enough. Therefore, he's always advancing. But again, how does this come about? You need the mentoring, you need the environment, and you need the engagement of the Torah mitzvahs. And only then do you have a sense of what it is. And once you have that sense, then you move. Just to end with one thing. Years ago, we used to have Jewish grandmothers. And Jewish grandmothers, more than she fed you latkes, on Hanukkah, much more than that. And they used to sing lullabies to their grandchildren or mothers. They used to say, Torah is the best schora. Torah is the best commodity. Schora means commodity. Torah is the best commodity. Shlomo says, Ki lechech tov nosat lechem. I've given you, God says, I've given you lechech tov nosat lechem. Torah so'yat tozovu. Because Torah is the greatest commodity, and there's the Creator himself saying it. Therefore, he's begging us, please don't abandon it, because I gave it to you. It's the essence and the core of your life. And therefore, don't underestimate its value and fully engage in it, because there's nothing which is its equivalent. Okay, we're going to stop here. Everybody should have a good day. We have Daf Yomi at 11 o'clock.
See you later, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Terrific.
Take care.
Thank you.